Teresa Skubic, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, November 25th. According to sources, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have agreed to the broad outlines of a memorandum of understanding that would give Alberta special exemptions from federal environmental laws and offer political support to a new oil pipeline to the BC coast. BC Premier David Eby says he wants any potential energy deal between Alberta and the federal government to include a cap or potentially a ban on the use of taxpayers' dollars to build a pipeline. Speaking to reporters, Eby said that he spoke to Carney on Monday morning about the upcoming memorandum of understanding between Alberta and Ottawa.
I had a conversation with the Prime Minister this morning. He's recently returned from South Africa. He has outlined to me that the agreement with Alberta is not finalized yet. And I took the opportunity of our conversation to outline British Columbia's perspective. First of all, that coastal First Nations consent and support is required for this conversation. And even if Alberta is indifferent to the legal rights of the coastal First Nations and their rights and title in the area, I'm sure they are not indifferent to the fact that coastal First Nations support for major projects like Silism's LNG Canada Phase 2, expansions to the Port of Prince Rupert, all of which involve the transport of products, including products from Alberta to Tidewater. That coastal First Nation support is required for those too. Second, that I do not believe that Alberta should have access to a $50 billion taxpayer-funded pipeline unless other provinces and territories have access to similar amounts of taxpayer funding. There is not a world in which the current price of oil, a private company is going to step up and pay for this pipeline across the north. This is the reason why not one single pipeline company has said if the conditions are right, they would build it. If it's built, that they would buy it. The reason for their silence is that they are not interested, just like they're not interested in buying the pipeline that we already have, the taxpayers own, that is for sale, if anybody's interested. I underlined for the Prime Minister how unacceptable it was to me to have Saskatchewan and Alberta speaking about matters in British Columbia without British Columbia at the table. This is not something that would happen to Quebec. This is not something that would happen to other provinces in the Federation. I don't know why the thought was that it would be okay for it to happen in British Columbia. But regardless, I was very clear that my expectation is that going forward, that British Columbia be at the table and that we're able to participate.
And Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe voiced his support for Alberta's proposed pipeline to the BC coast, saying that the project would benefit the entire Western Canadian economy.
We very much are supportive of Premier Smith's moves to become the proponent for this project and start to bring the conversation forward. And two, on behalf of Prime Minister Carney, we commend him for being open to having discussions around, some unconsulted policies that came into place under his predecessor that simply are unworkable and are hindering us achieving his aspiration of not only becoming a global energy superpower, but obtaining or getting to a point where we'd have the strongest economy in the G7. In order for that to happen, we need to be, as provincial premiers and as a federal government, supportive of each and every project in each and every industry in each and every province. And we certainly are supportive of all the projects that we see that may be constructed here, whether they be in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, or any other province across the nation. And I think that is what it truly means to be on Team Canada, is for us to support all of the projects regardless of where they are.
In Montreal, Health Minister Marjorie Michael announced that 6 million Canadians are now covered under the Canadian Dental Care Program. According to the minister, the plan has saved citizens covered by the program an average of $800 per year.
As of today, close to 6 million Canadians are currently covered under the plan, including more than 1.5 million Quebecers. And more than 3 million Canadians have received care, saving $800 on average per year. But this program is not about providing financial support. It's about improving lives. Canadians are receiving the preventive care they need. All of this help to ease the burden on Canada's healthcare system with fewer non-urgent trips to the emergency room for issues that could be treated in a dental office.
She says more than 27,000 providers participate in the program, offering essential care across the country. Minister Michael also announced $35 million over 3 years in funding to support 30 projects aimed at improving access to care and training. And the federal health minister isn't committing to an expert panel's roadmap for national pharmacare. She said Monday that the recommendations are non-binding and require cooperation with provinces.
What I want to say is they do their work, they provide, advice to the government, but they are an independent panel. And as you know, the government of Canada, we have to also work with our partners, our provincial and territorial partners, to see how we can better support them. And they are also reading the report right now.
Okay, thank you. And just as a follow-up, that report also recommended that Ottawa bypass the need for negotiations with provinces by funding medicines for everyone. What do you think of that recommendation?
Health services are a provincial responsibility and territorial responsibility. So my job is to work with my partners. And this is what I'm trying to do right now on many fronts, because particularly I will say at this time, we need to make sure that we build the strongest partnership as possible with the provinces and territories to improve the health of Canadians.
The panel urges Ottawa to fund a universal essential medicines list and install access to basic drugs in a law as a human right. A panel chair doctor estimates that the plan would cost about $3 billion after bulk buying savings. And trans allies and supporters were at the Alberta legislature Sunday morning rallying in opposition of the government's recent use of the notwithstanding clause when tabling Bill 9. Bill 9 introduces a ban on hormone therapy for youth under 16 and gender-affirming surgery for those under 18, barring transgender athletes over 12 years old from competing in female sports, making sexual health classes opt-in only, and requiring parental consent for pronoun changes in schools. Coming up after the break, I'll be sitting down with our contributor, David Clement, to unpack Alberta's new healthcare bill. We'll be right back. The Alberta government has tabled a bill that would allow for surgeons to charge patients for privately delivered procedures while keeping a foot in the public system billing taxpayers. Premier Danielle Smith's government previously said family physicians would be eligible, but they are not included in the proposed legislation. Government officials say the bill is about offering flexibility, reducing wait times, and giving Albertans the option to pay for procedures without having to travel out of the province.
I want to discuss the dual practice model that would modernize rules outlining how physicians participate in Alberta's publicly funded system. It is the most significant of the proposed amendments, as it reflects bold and innovative changes that will increase options for patients and physicians and shorten wait times. If passed, physician participation rules will change to give doctors the flexibility to work in both the public system and also in private settings. Dual practice will allow physicians to continue providing insured services through the provincial health insurance plan, while also delivering private services, giving them more flexibility and encouraging innovation. Alberta patients will continue to receive care through a strong public health system, but will also have the option to purchase services they are currently waiting for, such as hip, knee, or cataract surgeries. If passed, this dual practice model will include clear safeguards and be closely monitored to protect our public health care system. So dual practice physicians will be required to maintain fully separate records for public and private services, ensuring that no public funding is used to subsidize private care. Other safeguards could include requiring surgeons to other safeguards could include requiring surgeons in dual practice to perform a dedicated number or ratio of surgeries in the public system to qualify to practice in the private sector. And we could also limit certain specialties to public practice if shortages threaten access to essential care.
Joining us now to unpack what this means for the province is our contributor, David Clement. Now, David, let's start with actually understanding what this means. Could you start with walking us through the logistics of how dual practice actually works?
Yeah, so kind of as was explained in that clip, it will allow for physicians to work both in the public system and bill privately. That could be to a private insurance company, it could be somebody paying out of pocket. We're realistically looking at things like cataract surgery, knee replacement, hip replacement, that type of surgery where wait times are getting increasingly longer, not just in Alberta, but across the country. There is no word yet about what the ratio will be. And what I mean by ratio is the amount of surgeries or percentage of time a doctor has to spend in the public system before they can bill privately. And there is some limitation in terms of when they can actually do these. So right now it's being understood that it would largely be done outside of regular hours. So you're looking at evenings and weekends.
Now, the way the Alberta government is explaining this plan, it sounds pretty seamless, but what are the main criticisms here?
So the main criticisms is that it would prioritize those who have the ability to pay, as opposed to the priority being those who need it. There's also some concern about having surgeons do surgeries outside of regular hours, and that's just because there's already a shortage in many aspects of surgery, and there have been lots of reports about burnout in the medical system. So, for example, it may be one thing to have a surgeon who's capable of doing surgeries, let's say after hours or on a weekend, but you also need surgical nurses and all the other support mechanisms involved in that. So, I think those are some of the more finite criticisms of what's being put forward. And how we solve those, I think, is still a little bit, there's still some answers that need to be flushed out here from the province.
And critics are also arguing that this is opening the door to American style healthcare. Would you say that this is pretty accurate?
Well, no. No, because it's still universal, right? The healthcare system in Alberta would still be universal. So, in the same way that the existence of private schools does not mean that students in Alberta or anywhere else don't have universal access to grade kindergarten through grade 12 education. So, it isn't American style healthcare really in any way. It mirrors more of what Europe does. Almost every country in Europe has some version of this model. And for the most part, especially among countries whom we would consider peers, they spend less on a per capita basis in terms of public money, and they either have the same or better outcomes in terms of patients, whether that be everything from cancer down to wait times to have a knee replaced. So I would say it's more embracing the European model than anything that resembles the American model.
So, you mentioned European countries that have dual practice. What could Alberta or Canada actually copy from these systems?
Yeah, so a lot of the countries in Europe are different. France, for example, pays doctors a salary when they work in the public system, and they get fee for service in the private system. In Spain, I believe that only doctors who work exclusively in the public system are eligible for promotion. And that's a way to try and hedge against having an exodus of medical professionals leave into the private sphere. And that's where you would maybe have concerns over prioritizing access to care. And then, not in Europe, but Australia has about a 50-50 split between surgeons working in the private system versus the public system. So these are it may sound radical to Canadians who are very accustomed to our healthcare system, but it's not that radical of a alteration when you look at countries throughout Europe.
And would adapting to these types of systems change Albertan or Canadian healthcare from priority of need to ability to pay? Like, could it create some sort of a slippery slope?
Well, no. Because that already exists. It already exists because Canadians can travel abroad for healthcare to deal with these wait times. And in many senses, they do. I think the latest figures are around 400,000 Canadians leave the country for healthcare. And so the question is, would it be better if they were able to spend that money in Canada? I would argue that, yeah, that would probably be a far more desired outcome rather than having somebody go south of the border to the United States to pay for something like a knee replacement. If they have the means to pay and they want to do it, they could do it in Alberta, and that money stays in the economy and helps keep nurses employed and helps keep doctors in the province, which is, of course, a brain drain problem we have in the medical system, especially when you get into specialists like ear, nose, and throat and things like that. So I don't think so, mostly because that already exists. And we also have to look at the bigger picture here in terms of what the consequences of wait times are, right? So it's about 6.5 months in Alberta to get a new knee, to get a knee replacement. So if you're an oil and gas worker in Alberta, you're not working, well, you need a new knee. You're going on unemployment insurance. So that's going to cost taxpayers, if it's 6.5 months, 50% of cases exceed 6.5 months. You're going to be on EI for 6.5 months. That's around $18,000, $19,000 in EI payments. Well, the going rate for a knee replacement surgery privately is around exactly that much, around $18,000 or $19,000. And so if that person were to elect to pay out of pocket, they've drastically decreased the tax burden because they're not drawing on EI, they're getting back to work sooner. They're recovering quicker, they're getting back to work quicker. So the cost benefit there is relatively clear. And that's before you factor in what does life look like for someone who's waiting 6 months to have a knee replaced? How many months of painkillers does that involve? What are the mental health implications of having your salary drop drastically from whatever it was to whatever you get in EI? Are you taking on debt to get yourself through because you can't work and EI maybe doesn't cover your bills? And so once you factor all of that in, I think the benefits far outweigh whatever the negatives are. And yes, there are hurdles to get through, but there are examples from Europe. Some of them may not work in Canada, some of them may. But there's definitely a roadmap here outside of the binary that we always see, which is like, Canada or the United States. There is a third path, and it's most of Europe.
Now, if Alberta does in fact go this route, what could this mean for the healthcare system in other provinces? I mean, will it help with the
Yeah.
doctor shortage issue?
You could see a drain from other provinces if this works and is successful, and surgeons see that they can operate and practice in Alberta while making extra money on the side. You could see doctors move from provinces like Ontario to Alberta, unless those provinces reform themselves, and so it could create a drain, or it could put additional pressure on other provinces to get their act in order.
Well, David, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. We'll be right back. President Donald Trump says that he'll be visiting Beijing in April after speaking by phone with China's Xi Jinping. Trump says the two discussed Ukraine, fentanyl, and soybean sales, calling the U.S. China relationship extremely strong. Beijing highlighted different issues, including Taiwan, quoting Xi as saying that the island's return is part of the post war order. Analysts say that the phone calls reflect Beijing's tension with Japan after new comments linking Japan's military to any Taiwan conflict. The outreach comes as China resumes major U.S. soybean purchases and tightens control on chemical exports tied to fentanyl production. A federal judge has dismissed the criminal cases against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, ruling that the prosecutor who brought the charges at President Donald Trump's urging was illegally appointed by the Justice Department. The rulings from U.S. District Judge Cameron McGowan Curry amount to a stunning rebuke of the Trump administration's efforts to target Trump's political opponents, as well as its legal maneuvering to hastily install a loyalist prosecutor willing to file the cases. The orders make Lindsay Halligan, the latest Trump administration prosecutor, to be disqualified because of the manner in which they were appointed. Trump's spokesperson spoke to the press shortly after the news of the decision and defended the appointment of Halligan.
No, because Lindsay Halligan was legally appointed, and that's the administration's position. I know there was a judge who is clearly trying to shield Letitia James and James Comey from receiving accountability, and that's why they took this unprecedented action to throw away the indictments against these two individuals. But the Department of Justice will be appealing very soon, and it is our position that Lindsay Halligan is extremely qualified for this position, but more importantly, was legally appointed to it. I wouldn't say he's going after them. I think the president is more determined than ever to see accountability in this country, yes, and to correct the wrongs of the weaponization of our justice system that we saw under the previous administration and Joe Biden.
U.S. President Donald Trump's administration escalated pressure on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by designating the Cartel de les Soles as a foreign terrorist organization on Monday. The move is the latest step in the administration's intensifying campaign against drug trafficking into the U.S. and comes as Trump weighs potential military action against Venezuela, an option he has not ruled out. Such action, including possible air and land strikes, would mark a major expansion of the months-long operation that has already involved a large military buildup in the Caribbean and strikes on boats accused of smuggling drugs, resulting in more than 80 deaths.
I'm not going to broadcast any actions that may or may not be happening with respect to Venezuela. I know I've been very clear about the administration's position, as has the president and his national security team. We view the Maduro regime as being illegitimate, and the president has been very satisfied with the successful strikes against narco-terrorists and foreign terrorists that are illegally trafficking drugs towards the United States of America. He's not going to tolerate that, and you can expect to see those strikes continue.
From Latin America to Eastern Europe, Russia launched a wave of overnight attacks across Ukraine, killing at least 7 people, Ukrainian authorities have confirmed today. The strikes knocked out water, electricity, and heating in parts of Kyiv as emergency crews work to restore essential services amid freezing temperatures. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian strike in southern Russia killed 3 people and damaged several homes. That's according to local officials, adding to the intensifying cross-border hostilities. The escalation comes just days after U.S. and Ukrainian representatives met in Geneva to discuss a U.S.-Russia brokered peace proposal. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt spoke to the media about the progress on the peace plan.
I would point any critics to the words of the Ukrainians yesterday, in which they said that they feel very positive about this plan. They've been very involved. They have had direct input on the language of this plan, and that we are in direct communication and correspondence with them. Any idea, let me just finish with this, the idea that the United States of America is not engaging with both sides equally in this war to bring it to an end is a complete and total fallacy. And I saw a lot of misinformation and rumors and allegations against people in this building, such as Secretary Rubio and Special Envoy Wynkoff and the president himself, that they are favoring one side over the other. That could not be further from the truth. I have watched as the president and his team have worked around the clock overnight with both sides on endless phone calls, endless meetings to try to bring this war to a close. And any suggestion otherwise is a complete misunderstanding of the facts. It's coming from people who have no idea what they're talking about, or people who are pushing their own agenda, or maybe people who don't want to see this war come to an end. I don't know. Maybe they're profiting off of it. Maybe they benefit from it in some way, but nobody in this building benefits from war. We want to see this war come to an end, and that's what the president and his team are proudly working to do. And I think the critics should just take a step back and think about what happened with Israel and Gaza. There were a lot of doubters, and we got the hostages out, and this president secured a peace deal that still exists and is ongoing today. So everyone should just respect the work this administration is doing and watch the process unfold.
Yesterday on Parliament Hill, representatives from a number of civic and community groups called on Ottawa to act in response to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Sudan.
Millions have been forced to flee their homes, and entire regions are on the brink of famine. Some already face conditions that meet the criteria of famine. Yet the crisis remains largely absent from global headlines. Recent escalations in late October 2025 involved the RSF's capture of Al-Fashir after an 18-month siege that trapped tens of thousands of civilians in the city in West Sudan that serves as the capital of the North Darfur state. With this takeover, there have come many reports documenting humanitarian concerns that Yale University's Humanitarian Research Lab has said amounts to a comparable level of violence of the first 24 hours of the Rwandan genocide. We were appalled, but not surprised, to see a CBC article expose Canadian-made weapons used by the Rapid Support Forces who are participating in human rights violations in Sudan.
The group say Canada's response has not kept pace with the scale of the conflict, which has displaced millions and left countless civilians without access to food, medicine, or safe shelter. Specifically, the organization wants the federal government to impose an arms embargo on the United Arab Emirates, citing allegations that the UAE has been providing military assistance to the Rapid Support Forces, one of the key factions accused of fueling the violence.
It is the best interest of Canada and Sudan to impose an arms embargo on the UAE until RSF support ends. Adopt Bill C-233, Jenny Kwan's bill, to align exports with arms trade treaty. Launch an investigation of diversion of Canadian origin arms. Suspension of military exports to the UAE until clarity. Higher disclosure of Canadian firms abroad. Use Canada's $70 billion trade with the UAE to pressure and to end RSF arms supply. A stronger enforcement of Canada Special Economic Measures Act. In closing, we cannot preach peace while weapons fuel war. Sudan is today's test of our humanity. Canada must choose legacy or complicity. Never again is not a slogan. It is a promise. Sudan is where that promise must be kept. Thank you.
Police in northern Manitoba have recovered the bodies of two men who drowned in separate incidents. RCMP say searchers pulled one of the bodies from the Nelson River near Norway House over the weekend. They say footprints were leading to open water. That's where they discovered the second body. Mounties are warning people to stay off the ice and urging caution to those trying to walk on or cross waterways that appear to be frozen. A coalition of civil society groups is calling on Ottawa to withdraw its border security bill C-12. Officials say the bill could lead to violations of human rights in the immigration system and cannot be passed into law in its current form.
Dozens of groups, many of whom have cross-country reach and represent hundreds of thousands of people, applied to speak before the committee to this bill and were denied. Meanwhile, MPs heard repeatedly from border and policing agencies. The government has said that C-12 will strengthen Canada's immigration and borders. But on the contrary, it will only add to delays and backlogs, undermine due process, and multiply the likelihood of discrimination and violations of human rights.
And a number of concerns were raised on Parliament Hill by the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association. Members say there are serious workforce challenges facing both veterinarians and veterinary technicians.
It is estimated that our profession is currently short by several thousand veterinarians, and we will remain in a workforce deficit until at least 2031. Practices are struggling to recruit both veterinarians and registered veterinary technologists. The annual graduation rates from Canadian veterinary and registered veterinary technician colleges, despite recent increases to class sizes, only marginally cover attrition rates. Canada requires a number of internationally trained veterinarians to enter our workforce every year to keep up with the demand. This is why we are calling on the federal government to support the creation of a national testing center for internationally educated veterinarians, allowing qualified professionals to enter the workforce more quickly and efficiently.
Coming up after the break, during Monday's question period, Pierre Poilievre slammed Prime Minister Mark Carney for saying who cares when asked about his last conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump. We'll have this story and more of today's top national and international headlines right after the break. Forum Daily News will be back shortly. Speaker in question period on Monday. Pierre Poilievre took aim at Prime Minister Mark Carney, criticizing him for saying, "Who cares?" when asked over the weekend about the last time he spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister claimed during the last election that the U.S. tariffs were an existential crisis, and I quote, requiring that he immediately be elected to, quote, negotiate a win and get a deal by July 21st. Well, a few days ago, he was asked about the state of those negotiations, and he said there are no issues of importance to discuss. In fact, he said, who cares? Mr. Speaker, we care. We care about the workers who've lost their jobs and don't have paychecks to make their mortgage payments. Why doesn't he care?
In response, Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc defended the government's approach, stating that Ottawa will continue working towards a negotiated deal with the United States despite the political friction.
Just because the leader of the opposition keeps repeating the same line over and over again doesn't make it real. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition knows very well that our government was elected to defend Canadian workers and the Canadian economy. That's exactly what we did in a budget that was tabled in this House of Commons. The opposition decided not to support Canadian workers.
The Ontario government has passed a controversial bill that opponents warn will make it easier for landlords to evict tenants across the province. Bill 60, officially titled the Fighting Delays Building Faster Act, cleared third reading in a 71-43 vote at Queen's Park on Monday. The vote unfolded against a backdrop of intense protests in the public gallery, where demonstrators chanted "People over profit" and "Shame." People over profit! People over profit! People over profit! During the commotion, as one protester was being removed, Premier Doug Ford called out from the floor of the legislature, quote, "Go find a job, buddy." An opposition leader, Marit Stiles, posted a video on X responding to what happened after Bill 60 passed.
And when the bill passed, they erupted. There were chants of people over profits, and it filled the chamber. They were furious, and, as they should be, as I am. One protester yelled what every renter, I think, in this province already knows, which is, you're putting people on the streets. And you know what Doug Ford said? He said to them, get a job. I mean, it is hard to imagine a more insulting response. But anyways, it passed, the bill passed. But when I went back into the legislature and I introduced a motion later on, a motion to repeal Bill 60, we also decided to add into that to bring in real rent control. And I talked about the reality that renters are facing. That if you're making minimum wage in Ontario, you'd have to work 114 hours. That's 3 weeks of work just to afford the average rent before groceries, before anything else. And I asked a very simple question to the government, like, who is Bill 60 for? Because it's sure not for the single mom who's working 2 jobs and who can barely afford rent. And let me tell you, it ain't for the senior on a fixed income either who's facing eviction. And it's certainly not for the student who's struggling to afford their textbooks. It isn't. But they voted down that motion. And of course they did. It's not surprising because it was Doug Ford who removed rent control as soon as he got in. By the way, it was the NDP many years ago, back in Stephen Lewis's time, that forced the Conservative government of that day to commit to rent control. So that's right. That was a long time ago. And we held on to it for all those years. Doug Ford gets in, first thing he does, gets rid of rent control.
Many regions of southern Alberta were hit hard by a snowstorm on Monday, with some areas receiving up to 25 centimeters. The system also brought colder temperatures, and apparently it's making its way to other regions of the country. Dozens of flights were delayed or canceled at the Calgary International Airport, and our Western Canada Bureau Chief Hal Roberts caught up with Senior Program Meteorologist Alyssa Pedersen with Environment and Climate Change Canada to find out more.
Alyssa, many here in Calgary and across the province are now seeing a blanket of white, looking like a winter wonderland. My son's flight at the Calgary airport was delayed for 2 hours as crews were de-icing the wings. Will we receive even more of the white stuff, possibly later this week?
Yeah, so we are into winter, the winter season. This was the first snowfall event for southern Alberta of this year. It's a little bit late coming at the end of November here, but yeah, that's what we're looking at for even into later this week. We're looking at more snowfall, maybe a couple centimeters, not quite as much as the dump earlier in the week.
You know, many people I talk to say, we'll take the moisture with this rain or snow. We kind of need it for all the drought we've had here in southern Alberta. Now, where did the system originate from and where is it headed to next?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is your typical, what we call it's just an Alberta Clipper, a snowfall event in the wintertime. It happens as rainfall events in the spring and summer. It's essentially just a feed of moisture coming from the Pacific. It comes into BC, develops a low pressure system in the lee of the Rockies in Alberta here, and then usually trucks off to the east. In this case, it moved through Montana, parts of southern Saskatchewan, and then further east.
So will it hit central Canada, maybe in Ontario and Quebec?
Yeah, so usually when systems form, that's how weather patterns work in Western Canada. They develop here and then they move off, usually impacting either like Hudson Bay or sometimes they move into the States. Other times they move into the States and then back up into Ontario and Quebec. Yeah.
So what's the rest of the month looking like for our part here in the prairies for the first part of December and of course later this month? Can we maybe expect one of those legendary Chinooks to make its way over the Rockies, warm things up and melt all the snow?
So, well, unfortunately, probably not. We're actually looking at a pretty significant change in the weather pattern. So, right across the fall so far, we've been very much above normal, pretty much right through the second half of October, right in through November here. The weather pattern change that's coming, this is kind of the first shot, but we're getting into some of those cooler than normal temperatures. Normals for this time of year are about that 0 degrees for daytime highs. We're going to be below that for much of this week, maybe a brief reprieve up to that 0 this weekend. But indications are that the first weeks of December and even right into the rest of the month are going to be very, very cold.
So the mercury is plummeting. So will that polar vortex be making its way to other regions as well?
Yeah. So, well, what happens is we have these early indications of the polar vortex weakening. So the polar vortex always exists. It's just essentially a very strong jet stream that holds colder air up and around the North Pole in northern Canada. In this case, it's going to essentially oscillate a little bit and become where it pushes down into parts of central and southern Canada. In that case, yeah, we are looking at that disruption, and it looks like it's going to happen for the first week of December.
Alyssa Pedersen, Senior Program Meteorologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Thanks so much for your time today.
A copy of the first Superman comic discovered by three brothers while clearing out their late mother's attic was sold for $9 million at a Texas auction house, setting a new record for the most expensive comic book ever sold. The sale surpasses the previous high of $6 million set last year by another Superman-related issue. The 1939 Superman #1, one of the 500,000 first edition copies printed by Detective Comics Inc., is now among only a small handful known to still exist. The brothers found the pristine issue buried beneath old newspapers and cobwebs while sorting through their mother's San Francisco home last year.
So we had for auction the very highest certified graded copy of Superman #1, graded 9.0 on a scale of 1 to 10. And there was a lot of spirited bidding. It shattered the previous world record. And I think a lot of people, globally got very excited to see something like this. And I think what actually really added to the story was how it was found that this was, a new find that no one had ever seen before. A few months ago, a form was submitted through our website saying they had a Superman #1 and a few other comic books. And as you can imagine, we get a lot of requests like that. There's a lot of reprints of Superman 1, and luckily they had some nice pictures. So I immediately called them and they told me they found it in the attic in San Francisco area while they were cleaning out her mother's house, and it ended up being in unbelievable condition. So I jumped on the next flight and flew out to San Francisco and went and saw it in person.
I'm Teresa Skubic, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca. Good night, Canada.